On March the 20th, 2023, an event occurred that will go down in history as a shame in the relationship of power to the Church. Members of the Synod of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church waited for almost 3 hours near the office of President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, but to no avail. The reason was more than serious: the expulsion of the Church from the Kyiv-Pechersk Lavra. However, the president ignored the Synodals. Of course, the head of the warring country has a very tight schedule. He is not obliged to accept everyone who wants to suddenly communicate with the president. But the question is not at all that Zelenskyy did not accept the Synodals. The problem is how it was done. The primate and hierarchs of the country's largest denomination were demonstrably kept outdoors near the checkpoint for several hours, and then they were driven away with a siren, and this despite the fact that Zelenskyy was in place and could have certainly found at least a few minutes. The bishops were not invited to wait inside. They were not even offered to sit down. In short, the situation can be described in 2 words: demonstrative humiliation. This humiliation does not refer just to his beatitude and top hierarchs. This is a demonstrative humiliation of millions of believers of the UOC, humiliation of millions of voters, citizens of Ukraine. That's the tragedy. Is it possible to imagine that the chief rabbi of Ukraine, the head of the Uniats, or Serhiy Demenko would be kept on the street in the same way? We all know the answer. On the morning of that day, a meeting of the Synod of the UOC was held in the Kyiv-Pechersk Lavra. It took place in a critical situation for the Church. On March the 10th, the authorities announced that the UOC was obliged to leave the Lavra by March the 29th. More than 200 monks, the Kyiv metropolis, theological schools, seminary and academy, icon painting and sewing workshops, etc. The authorities did not name any intelligible reasons for such an act. Allegedly, some kind of interdepartmental commission discovered some illegal buildings on the territory of the lower Lavra. No one says which ones. The Ministry of Culture classified the information. But everyone understands perfectly well that all this is just a clumsy pretext. The Church is expelled from its ancient shrine simply because it is the will of the leadership, or rather, the president.
Зеленський натиснув на Ткаченка. Тобто це було пряме розпорядження Зеленського. Тобто Зеленський сказав: Ткаченко, розривай цю угоду.
MP Potorayev and Minister of Culture Tkachenko called the relics of the Kyiv-Pechersk fathers as museum exhibits and demanded that the UOC return them to the state. The police stand at the exit of the monastery and search every car and every monk. Potorayev promised that on March the 29th, the patriotic community would come to liberate the Lavra, while the radical Korchinsky, who had already seized the Lavra back in 1992, said that if the monks did not leave voluntarily, they would crawl out of the monastery. Under these circumstances, the members of the Synod, headed by his Beatitude Onufri, decided to speak directly with Zelenskyy and find out why such repressions are being taken against the Church. After all, the UOC did nothing the authorities could blame it for. The bishops arrived at the president's office at 12:40 p.m. Almost immediately, a certain clerk came out to them and offered to hand an appeal to Zelenskyy. The bishops refused and began to wait for Zelenskyy. Half an hour later, a woman came out to them with the same proposal. The bishops refused and began to wait for Zelenskyy. They waited an hour and another hour and another hour, standing outside in cool March weather. The UOC Synodals are most elderly people in their late 70s. The office of the president did not invite them to wait inside, nor did they even take out the chairs. When the assistants to the hierarchs brought pieces of foam plastic so that the bishops could sit at least on the concrete blocks, the policemen immediately jumped up and demanded that everything be removed. Absolutely shameful and boorish attitude of the authorities towards the hierarchs of the Church, to which millions of Ukrainians belong, whose members defend the country on the front line, which in the first hours of the war condemned the aggression of the Russian Federation, which provides enormous support to the army and those in need. But what should Zelenskyy do when all the clerks have already been sent, when the elderly bishops are ready to wait for him on their feet for many hours? But meeting with them is below presidential dignity. When the situation becomes simply indecent for him, the siren button comes to the rescue. Kyiv channels wrote about an atypical air raid alarm, which was sounded only in the capital and lasted for only 14 minutes. However, during this time, the police drove the bishops out of the territory of the president's office. The situation was resolved. Already a few hours later, the Lavra receives information to be qualified as the president's response to an attempted meeting from the Synodals of the UOC. Since March the 21st, access to the relics of the Kyiv Cave's venerable fathers, as well as 3 temples of the Lavra, is closed for believers.
Завтрашнього дня, тобто з самого ранку, доступ до печер і ближніх, і дальніх, доступ для вклоніння мощам Києво-Печерських угодників музеєм буде припинений, обмежений. Відвідувати печери, а також Христово-Звиженський, Анно-Зачатівський і Теплий храм наші віряни не зможуть.
Emotional people have states that are commonly referred to as biting the bit, when hostility towards someone they consider an enemy compels them to do very strange things. It seems that the expression "the worse the better" is best suited for Zelenskyy now in his relations with the church. But can the head of state allow this to himself? Zelenskyy, strange as it sounds, is a servant of the people and is obliged to act for their benefit, including for the benefit of those millions of believers who voted for him in the elections. After all, Zelenskyy would approach religion in a completely different way before the elections. True though, it was Islam, not Orthodoxy. Then he could even apologize to Kadyrov for hurting religious feelings of the latter.
Если мы обидели хоть кого-то из представителей мусульманского мира и на уровне религии, потому что религия болезненная тема,
тонкая, да.
Очень тонкая грань, и не надо. Это некрасиво просто обижать другие там интересы религиозные, тогда просто нехорошо. Вот что я сказал перед всем мусульманским миром, если наши ребята, я за них, потому что наших ребят могут не знать там в СНГ там, и так далее, но я за них хочу попросить прощения.
Today, Zelenskyy does not ask for forgiveness for his ex-colleagues. Well, they did not offend Muslims, only the Orthodox. The Orthodox who can be showered with foul language and whose temples can be insolently raided. The temples that these very Orthodox restored with their own hands, in which they invested huge personal savings, time and effort after the Soviet desolation. Let's take a look at the pictures of the Lavra when the state returned it to the believers in 1988 and the one that we see now. The difference is remarkable, isn't it? But instead of abolishing thuggish nationalization of church property, which the Bolsheviks did 100 years ago, Zelenskyy clones their actions. He likewise robs believers of the relics restored by them. What for? To give them to the correct confession led by Sergei Dymenko. There is a problem, however. Dymenko has no one to fill the Lavra. He has about 240 monks for the entire oku. Therefore, with the assistance of the authorities, he persuades the brethren to simply recognize his authority and not leave anywhere.
Я також засвідчую, браті, що всі з вас, хто послідують вимогам канонів Томосу, відкинуть беззаконну владу Москви, продовжать своє служіння в Лаврі. Як священноархімандрит Лаври, я відкритий до діалогу і спілкування. Наша мета – зберегти і оновити обитель, очистити її від омани руського міра. Ми готові до співпраці з усіма, хто поділяє це прагнення.
And now let's compare it with the appeal of the fake renovationist Metropolitan Innokenty Pustinsky, to whom the Bolsheviks gave the Lavra 99 years ago, in 1924. Brothers and sisters, inhabitants of the Kyiv monasteries, you see how it is getting more and more difficult for you. The cloisters, one after one, pass into the jurisdiction of the Holy Synod of the Ukrainian Church are closed. The main shrine of Ukraine, the Kyiv-Pechersk Lavra, has been transferred to my jurisdiction. Stop being stubborn, leave aside your political game, and show that your cloisters are dear to you. Do not be embarrassed by their transfer to my jurisdiction and stay where you are. As you can see, only 100 years have passed for the history to repeat itself one-to-one. The authorities act in the same way. The false bishops speak almost the same sly words. The communists soon became disillusioned with the renovationists and stopped supporting them. The reason is simple: their temples were empty. People did not go to them. The renovationists were expelled from the Louvre. Inokeny Pustinsky was exiled and eventually shot. The power of the communists also ended, but the church was reborn. Today, the state is expelling the church from the Louvre and letting new renovationists there. It is logical to assume that the end of current developments will be similar. The Church of Christ will be purified and reborn. And now, there is a choice before us like 100 years ago: to be with the church or to join its persecutors. Beware making a mistake.